I feel like I should start by saying that while we will get to the contemporary world by the end of the talk, we're actually going to start in early modernity, because I myself am an early modernist, so that's just letting you all know. We'll get there. I promise we'll get to the contemporary world. So I think in general, when one speaks about capitalism, we're tempted to speak endlessly about mobility, about flows, about exchanges, about cycles. In short, to talk about capitalism as itself a certain kind of movement, right? We think about migration, we think of the problematic liberation of serfs who were formerly tied to land, now moving into cities. We think of the forced migrations of kidnapped and enslaved Africans. We think of colonists sailing across the Atlantic, and of migrations around the world in search of work, stability, prosperity, and all kinds of things. We think a lot about movement, right? And whether one applauds or critiques all of these forms of movement, I think the reigning sort of understanding of capitalism as a force is that it's concerned with dynamic movement. And so I think when we tell the history of capitalism, then we're sort of tempted to tell a history of vast movements across the globe. I would like to offer a different story, a counter story, one that argues that rather than conceiving of capitalism as a history of movement, migration, or flow, it is more helpful or more accurate to think of capitalism, or the history of capitalism, as itself a history of confinement. Or rather, I think we can think productively and dialectically about capitalism as a system that makes both land and labor more mobile, specifically in order to enclose it and to fix it in space and time. So let's consider just sort of briefly a series of institutions central to the formation, maintenance, and continuation of capitalism that I think expand on this thesis. And I'm going to speak really briefly, or a little bit less briefly, about the first one, and then I'm just going to name 8 other institutions, because I can't do an exhaustive job of talking about all of them in 20 minutes. So the first site, I think, of confinement in the history of capitalism is, I think, the most obvious one, and it's the enclosure of land. Again, here's my early modernism showing. Apologies. I think the story is probably pretty familiar, but I'll go over it in kind of roughshod fashion, and we can talk about it more explicitly or specifically if you all want in the Q&A. But generally, in around the beginning to middle of the 15th century, European landowners, specifically starting in Britain and then kind of moving to France, to Germany, to Spain, to the Low Countries, engaged in a new strategy of wealth accumulation, which was the creation of specifically hedged land enclosures that forced poor peasants off their land, confining them or moving them into the urban space, if that's the story you go with, right? And turned them into the first properly proletarian workforce in history. The birth of capitalism as a world system was dependent on the creation of these hedges, right? These are these sort of physical markers of the boundaries of private property and land. Hedges were, thus in a certain sense, the first tactic of capitalist dispossession, and emerged as a tactic that took its aim specifically at the mobility of the poor. Enclosure was about replacing non-capitalist forms of agricultural subsistence, often that had previously been organized in kind of proto-communal and democratic ways, and in replacing this system with the system of private property, specifically designed to turn that private property of land into accumulation or input for capital. And in Europe, the strategy of enclosure was justified around the idea that communal administration itself was inefficient, that it allowed people to sustain themselves with too little work to properly inculcate their moral senses, and that the land itself was not productive enough. And we can talk about all of the wonderful early modern citations about all of these kinds of discourses if you want. But so land enclosures, while most frequently talked about as a tactic inside Western Europe that sort of sparked this transition from feudalism to capitalism was also, I think importantly, a common strategy to the imposition of colonial capitalism in the Atlantic world. Indigenous land in the Atlantic world, specifically in the Americas, was declared not only the property of various imperial crowns, but it was specifically enclosed into private parcels of land that were conceived to have been previously unproductive because they weren't held under the system of private property and capitalism by indigenous communities. Many of the same discourses that were used to justify land enclosures in Europe were repeated in order to capture indigenous land, now with a decisively racist and racializing overtone. The same themes persist, those about productivity, the need for individual ownership, the need for a kind of inculcating moral sensibility about work. But these were now coupled with the assumption that only European-style capitalist agriculture constituted proper work, and that indigenous forms of sustenance and subsistence were indicative of a kind of existential deficiency, right? So we have this like story about the history of land under capitalism in both Europe and abroad, in the Atlantic world more broadly, that itself is the relationship to land that kind of spurs on the capitalist relation. And we can talk about this more in Q&A, but I sort of take it to be standard that European capitalism would not have been possible without colonization and slavery. And we can talk about that more if that premise is unclear, but that's the position from which I start. So that's the sort of first move. And here I just want to mark some other institutions that we can see through the history of capitalism as histories of confinement or as spaces of confinement. But I won't talk that much about them. So on the one hand, or here's, I guess this is number 2 because 1 was enclosure. 2 is the institution of the European workhouse. We have the sort of, then 3 would be the creation of a specifically domestic sphere for white European women. We have 4 as the institution of the slave ship on the Middle Passage. 5th would be the plantation system. 6 would be the asylum or the hospital. 7, and we're going to return to this one a lot at the end of the talk, is obviously the prison. In states, we also have a system of the reservation, where indigenous people have been sort of forced off into enclosed spaces. And then we can also talk about the fixation of kind of urban slums or shanty towns. I think we can think about these spaces as themselves kinds of confinement, and of course I'm not in any way suggesting that this is an exhaustive list. Like these are just a starting point for talking about the history of capitalism as confinement. Each of these institutions were, or continue to be, integral to the functioning of capitalism as a global system that I take to be fundamentally not only about class relations, but also profoundly about race, gender, ability, sexuality, and the nation-state project. I think, just saying that right now, I think that the 10th institution that's absolutely obvious would be the creation of nation-state borders, right, as a certain kind of confinement also. So I'll not have time, obviously, in these 20 minutes to exhaustively explain how each of these institutions was central to the rise or maintenance of capitalism, but if any of those linkages are unclear, I'm happy to talk about them in Q&A. But what I am interested in using the remainder of my time in exploring is the possibility for generating a more theoretical analysis about how and why confinement becomes such a constant and concerted strategy of capitalist accumulation. But moreover, what interests me in the strategy of confinement is its specifically differentiated nature. So while many groups, the poor, the mad, the feminized, the racialized, the vagrant, the rebel, the criminal, were all variously subjected to modes of confinement, their confinements were themselves quite radically different. The domestic confinement of European women can in no way be reduced or compared to the racialized confinement or violence of the Middle Passage. Indeed, these institutions and structures were precisely important or precisely fulfilled their functions for capital on the basis not of their similarities, but on the basis of their differences. In short, I propose that I explore at one and the same time the commonality of a capitalist strategy of confinement through a differential analysis of the multiple logics of confinement produced over the history of capitalism. So there are sort of, I think, two different, but again, interrelated levels at which I want to talk about enclosure as a kind of theoretical analytic that opens up a sort of window onto capitalist logic and strategy. The first is rather straightforward. It's a kind of spatialized confinement. So that this is partially what I mean by enclosure, is like a physical space, right? And even though I mean this in a literal sense, I don't think that the literalness of it means that it's a simple process, right? But in the second place, and in a kind of much more metaphorical kind of way, there's a different kind of confinement, I think, that operates under capitalism, and I think it's a sort of confinement to an ascribed or ascriptive identity, or a site in the accumulative process of capital. I'm still working on the language here, this is new work. But when I say an ascribed identity, I mean the identities that are put upon us rather than the ones that we take up as positions of struggle or sites of resistance. So the theory goes something, I think, like this. The physical spaces of confinement, precisely because they are so differentiated, are intended to produce different kinds of subjects for capitalism or of capitalism, different kinds of people that fulfill different kinds of functions for capital. We can think about this as a kind of combined and uneven development sort of analysis, right? But rather than localizing this development on, let's say, the relative possibilities of industrialization in different parts of the world or at different times, I'm talking about a kind of combined and uneven development of capitalism's form of subjectivity or forms of life. For example, the confinement to domestic space for European women allows them, in a certain sense, or forces them to be enclosed into a function of reproducing white labor for capitalist exploitation, right? And in this sense, it is the confinement of domesticity that produces the sort of metaphorical, theoretical, but also lived and quite violent enclosure of white femininity with all of its rigid boundaries, normative expectations, and punitive exactions for deviating from its image. This is altogether another subject position that is produced by the confinement of the slave ship or the plantation, right? These are enclosures that produce rigid expectations of a racialized subclass. And in particular, in many places in the Atlantic world, this racialized subclass was, after a certain period of time, almost exclusively defined in and through blackness. And thus, it is through the confinement, first in the slave ship and then in the plantation, that allows for the brutal and inhuman system of racialized chattel slavery to produce the wealth that itself produced, the industrial capitalist system. Right? So two very different kinds of examples there. But it's in this sense that I want to follow an analysis given by two other early modern thinkers of capital like myself, Richard Burt and John Michael Archer, who argue that one can conceive of sexuality in early modernity as being subject to the very same structure of enclosure as land. So they speak extensively about, quote, the redefinition and enclosure of sexuality within the symbolic order that accompanied the process of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, end quote. So in their analysis and in mine, the structure of land enclosure and the enclosure of various social identities are not random or separate events in the history of capitalism. We can say, rather, that they are not only temporally, but logically and structurally linked. And so Burt and Archer specifically emphasize the figure of enclosure itself as a, quote, uneven ground on which sexuality and politics meet. Enclosures were historically part of the very rigid system that inaugurated an enclosure of sexuality into a kind of rigid heterocompulsivity with a premium on reproductive futurity. And likewise, the system in which sexuality is enclosed allows not only for the construction of figures who elicit shame and discipline, but specifically creates a narrative in which those who rebel against the rising regime of capitalism can be punished, marginalized, and confined through a strategy of sexualizing them. Burt and Archer, for example, explain that resistors in the early modern world, and they talk about here witches, rebels, papists in Protestant countries, were often constructed as sodomites in order to portray them as deviant, perverse, and evil. So to this analysis, we could add, right, and this is a place where Britt and Archer don't go, but we could add that this strategy of sexualization was particularly deployed against people of color, indigenous people, enslaved people, on the basis of their sort of supposedly lascivious, non-monogamous, debauched modes of sexual relations, right? So there's this like history of common strategy in terms of the enclosure of sexuality and the enclosure of land that were themselves both part of the creation and maintenance of a capitalist system that also allowed for a kind of chain of signification to be developed between subject positions that resisted capital and subject positions that were then sexualized. So all of this strikes me as particularly important for a contemporary analysis of race, gender, sexuality, and ability under contemporary capitalism, even though my examples have thus far been derived from early modernity. I think it helps us think about the ways in which the interactions between capitalism, race, gender, sexuality, and ability can be grounded in a certain kind of materialist history. But moreover, I think thinking about these relations specifically with regard to the enclosure of land gestures toward Marx's own conception of wealth and value, which he argued repeatedly had its, quote, original sources in land and labor. Right? Land and labor themselves are kind of linked for Marx. By linking the enclosure of land to a general capitalist strategy of confinement, we begin to reconceptualize the linked fate of workers and the world or land in a way that is undoubtedly pressing for our time of ecological disaster. Okay, so that's a lot of framing, but let's get to the contemporary issue here, which is the relationship between this analysis of enclosure, confinement, and identity to mass incarceration. I wrote this piece from a particular perspective, that is one who was sitting less than an hour's drive from Attica Prison in New York, the site of the famed prisoner uprising in 1971. And I was writing this paper amidst the largest prison strike in United States history, which is, we should note, still ongoing right now, this day, this minute. People are resisting. The account I give of mass incarceration is thus rooted in the system of the United States and my position as an American, and we can talk about in what ways this analysis might differ for prisons in other places. But so the particular phenomena of mass incarceration I want to think about is characterized by a few profoundly specific features, right? Its massive character, the whole 1% of the United States population is in prison, that it was declared specifically at a period of time, that drugs in particular, the drug war was declared in the late 70s at precisely the same moment in which neoliberal efforts to reorganize United American society was steadfastly underway. And that specifically, this is the third thing, the phenomena of mass incarceration is, especially in the United States, primarily a strategy of racial social control, right? It's just a racist system. So it's clear that confinement to the prison cell and to the prison label, which persists after release from the cell, from the cage, are the contemporary replacements for the strategies of racial confinement that we saw in earlier periods, the slave ship, the plantation, redlining, the particular that part of town, right? These sorts of spatial confinements. The main and marked deficiency, I think, of the kind of account that's offered by someone like Michelle Alexander in writing about mass incarceration is its lack of a structural explanation of the way in which the system of confinement is intimately related to capitalism, right? All well and good, not her project, but I think as Marxist-Feminists, or at least people interested in Marxist feminism, we need to ask the question, how is the history of racialized confinement, including mass incarceration, linked to the development of capitalism? I'm obviously in my one remaining minute, I'm not going to answer exhaustively this question, but I want to gesture towards sketching out an answer. And I think there are kind of 5 things we can talk about, that we can talk more about in Q&A. The first is that the history of criminality has always been intertwined under capitalism with those who are seen as a threat to the system itself. Right? The birth of the modern system of incarceration was precisely about a strategy of stabilizing a newly unstable world rife with resistance, and always targeted those who had the least to gain and the most to lose from the perpetuation of the capitalist system, which we could argue, at least in the United States, are people in the lowest position in our sort of racialized cost system. The second, obviously we could talk about, is the profit generated through private prisons. We could thirdly talk about the way in which prisons in the United States continue to make use of de facto slave labor by making and forcing incarcerated people to produce objects for multinational corporations. We can talk specifically about its function, fourthly, as a colorblind system of racial oppression that therefore meshes quite well with liberal discourses in a sort of pseudo-multicultural world. And then we can also talk about prison in its function as a set of social stratification, and therefore a site specifically of Black and brown enclosure. So I'm gonna end there. That was a lot in 20 minutes. But thank you all for listening, and I'm so excited to hear the Q&A and to hear what my fellow panelists have to say. Thanks.